Brothers and sisters, as you know, we continue to look at these subsequent letters that came to the Ephesian congregation. We wrapped up our study in the book of Ephesians, that letter properly written to them, and now we're moving on and we're tracing their history. That's the way I've been thinking about it, as you know. So there's been three main areas. You can probably quote them to me at this point. One area that this congregation continued to face was that of dealing with false teaching, and so we've spoken to that quite a bit. Another area is what has been called the social issues, which is kind of where we're looking now, issues that pertain to roles in the congregation. What do the men do? What do the women do? What do we do with widows, etc.? What are the leaders supposed to do? This is the area in which we're looking at these days. And to tie them all together, this third, not really issue, but really the main issue that Paul and the other apostles that write to the Ephesian Christians, they're concerned with keeping the aim front and center, and that aim is to trust the gospel with a sincere faith, and then to express that gospel in love to God and through love to one another. And you know that this is how Paul opened his letter to 1 Timothy, that the goal of our instruction are these things: love that issues forth from a pure heart, and a sincere faith, and this pure conscience that is built from the gospel. And so these are Christians. They are receiving further instruction from the apostles, and these are the things that we give our attention to again this morning. We must keep all these things focused upon the Lord Jesus Christ. That aim must continually be our aim. Jesus Christ died, rose again, saving us from sin and death, reconciling us to God, and now we are called to be His people. And so the last couple of weeks we have spoken of this people, us, the congregation, or really the whole church as the family of God, which is exactly what Paul calls it in chapter 3. We looked at that text a little more closely last week. That the church of God is this family of God. It is the household of God. It's the household of faith, and it is the place of truth. And how is it that each person, men, women, children, widows, elders, deacons, etc., or et al., how are they all to conduct themselves within this household? And that's really the way to understand the whole of 1 Timothy. That these are instructions from the Apostle Paul to Timothy to instruct the church. This is how you're to be together. This is how you're to live your life together as the family of God in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we've done that. And so now we continue actually back in chapter 2. Last time we were here, we considered verse 8, where Paul gives instructions for the men. That the men are to be particularly focused on praying. The men are to be the main prayers of a congregation wherever the gospel appears. As he says, in every place, this is what the gospel produces. The gospel produces this outworking of godliness in the men, and that one of those first fruits is men who pray, and men who pray in such a way that they are not lifting up hands of unholy living, but they are actually living in faithfulness and consistency with the gospel, and that gospel is bearing fruit in their relationships with one another. Verse 8 says that there's no wrath or dissension between the men. That when the men gather and they do in fact worship God, they do in fact present themselves as prayers to God, they are reflecting a true reality and a true unity of what the gospel is producing between them. And so there's no wrath, there is no dissension, there is genuine love that is produced among the men. Well, in keeping with the flow then, we now come to verse 9. We now come to verse 9 to the ladies. Pick up with me here in the text, and I'll read verses 9 down through 15. Likewise, Paul says, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modesty and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. So Paul, after addressing the men, now turns to address really not the women directly, but actually addressing Timothy to address the women directly. And so he is to cover three main areas. One, how the women are to adorn themselves with clothing and good works. How the women are to adorn themselves with clothing and good works. Two, how the women are to learn in the congregation in all submission and quietness. And then three, he addresses this interesting matter pertaining to motherhood. And so we will talk about those things in the weeks ahead. I only have time this morning for this first element. How is it that women are to adorn themselves? How is it that they are to clothe themselves and carry themselves, not only with regard to literal clothing, but also clothing themselves with good works? I have a few things that I need to say before we actually get in and unpack the text. First, let me say that it should not strike us as strange or odd that the Lord would have His apostles address clothing for Christian women. Of course it does. It does, in fact, strike us as a bit odd, and I think that's due to our own culture and society. Well, we must remember, as Peter said in 2 Peter 1, that Christians are, in fact, given everything needed for life and godliness in the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Peter says Christians are given everything needed for life and godliness. This includes even how Christian women are to approach clothing. It does, in fact, matter to God, even though it has been popular to say it doesn't really matter to God about my clothing. It really does matter to God. And so the Lord has His apostle address these very things. And Paul, which is, I've looked for it, he doesn't once apologize for it. He doesn't wince, and he doesn't speak so carefully that he doesn't actually say anything. He gives instruction to the women, or to Timothy, and then to Timothy to the women. He gives them instruction on how to think about and how to approach clothing. Quite honestly, how refreshing. In a society in which we tiptoe around these sorts of things, Paul's just like, the gospel addresses this. The gospel has outworking for how a woman carries herself, how she adorns herself. What is also countercultural, and I'll just point this out, especially in our day, is that Paul, I remind you, he's a man. A man impresses Timothy, another man, to teach the women about these things. How daring. This is radical in our culture and the dynamics that exist here. That a man would tell another man to instruct the women in principles related to how they adorn themselves. Didn't Paul get the memo that there are women in our society that don't like that? Shouldn't he be a little more careful? Well, Paul is not concerned about the ladies in broader society. He's addressing Christians. And he's instructing Timothy to address Christian women. Women who have already, honestly, humbly submitted themselves to Christ and welcomed Christ's instructions through Christ's messengers, even if those messengers are in fact men. For this is how the Lord has designed His church. We know from these Spirit-given words, these Christ-given words, that it is the Apostle Paul, sent by Christ Himself, which is what the word apostle means, that Christ, through the Apostle Paul, instructs Timothy to establish qualified men who will have the responsibility and role to instruct the whole church. There's just a culture within the congregation where men are addressing all of the things that the Scriptures say that we ought to address. This means, for the most part, that Christian women, as well as all the other men, are instructed by the Lord by men, by qualified men, especially when it comes to sound doctrine. But as is the case here, not only instruction in sound doctrine, not just theology, not just the tenets of the faith, not just in the propositions of the gospel, but also in the outworking of that gospel, as the Scriptures do themselves, not only in sound doctrine, but I'll say it this way, in sound living. So living in the gospel, and living in the gospel produced godliness is what Paul concerns himself in this letter. It does include, in fact, how Christian women are to approach clothing. And I know, and we know, that this grates directly against the prevailing ethos of the day, but this shouldn't be in any way considered inappropriate or out of bounds or unsafe, and certainly not un-Christ-like. For the Christian woman has a humble heart and understands that it's not about men controlling women. It's about learning to be a spirit-controlled woman. She lives her life to please the Lord, and it pleases the Lord to give her instruction in these things through the Scriptures. And He gives those instructions even through originally men, and even this morning through another man. It's the same for everyone in the congregation. They're to receive instruction in these things. Now, before I go any further, I need to address a common issue with this passage. And normally, I try not to share with us the scholarship that's connected to these things. You don't believe it, but I do try not to share all the sweat, just the sweets, as one preacher once said, right? But this morning, I do want to share some of the sweat that goes behind understanding this text, because it's important, and because it's a popular claim. The claim is made, isn't Paul just dealing with cultural issues here as he addresses the women of Ephesus? Isn't this really rooted in the Ephesian culture, and that's why Paul says what he says here, and that everything in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, are to be strictly interpreted as pertaining to an Ephesian issue, not a universal church issue. This is a very famous line and popular line of reasoning. This line of reasoning causes one to conclude that the things that Paul says to women here are only to be viewed through the lens that Paul was really dealing with the women who used to belong to the temple cult of Diana or Artemis. As we know from our own historical study in the book of Acts, that the temple was there, and it was the temple devoted to Artemis, and great is Artemis of the Ephesians. This was their religious culture, and this was really their economic wheelhouse for all things pertaining to Ephesus. Well, the thinking continues on from here to understand the Ephesian context, and women in particular, that there was a cult, and really the whole society was built around this cult of Diana that had women in charge of everything. But according to these historical studies, that women were the priestesses, the city managers, and the leaders, and the whole society was predominantly matriarchal. Women ran everything. And now that they had converted to Christianity, they've heard the gospel, they converted to Christianity, they've rejected the claims of the religious ideas connected to Artemis, these now Christian Ephesian women, in particular, were having a difficult time reflecting a more Christian creational order sort of thing, right? And so they needed to be instructed how to tone it down a bit, right? So these women needed to be told to dress a certain way. They needed to be told not to teach men and to be quiet in the church gathering. And this perspective is that Paul is dealing with only an Ephesian issue, and therefore what he says here does not apply directly to Christian women in other cultures, in other times, and other places. Okay? But this text, as I think I'll say it again in some other way, this text is a temporal instruction for the Ephesian women and not a universal instruction for Christian women everywhere. Well, time out, Jeff. Doesn't cultural context matter? It absolutely matters a ton. It absolutely matters a ton. We can miss all kinds of things if we do not study the cultural context in which Scriptures have been originally written or where they had been originally received. One simple, very simplistic example of this is just from last week when we considered 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15 more closely, where Paul calls the church the pillar and buttress of the truth. As I mentioned, Paul is literally making an allusion to the temple of Artemis, which was built with 127 pillars and buttresses. Paul is not making some out-of-the-air sort of analogy. He's like, oh, you know that big temple on the end of town? God is building you not into one of falsehood like that, but into one of truth, right? So that's a simple example of cultural context. There's all kinds of things. But cultural context must actually be true. History that is studied and history that is interpreted must be studied truthfully and must be interpreted truthfully. Because it's quite another thing than to just see that there's some maybe temple allusion in 1 Timothy chapter 3. It's quite another thing to cast aside, or at best deeply weaken true apostolic teaching in chapter 2 that's directed to the women of the Ephesian church, all in the name of cultural background. It would take a mighty, mighty argument to undo authoritative, God-breathed words. You following me? A few people have tried to do so. A few people have tried to undermine the authority of this text based on their understanding of cultural context, of history. Building, and the truth is, when you survey the literature, you see that this idea of cultural context doesn't really begin to show up, surprise, surprise, in the late 1960s and 70s among American scholars. And most of those in the 60s and 70s were not at all in our theological wheelhouse. They were certainly on the liberal side of things. Then again in 1992, a married couple, Richard and Catherine Kroger, wrote a famous book, now famous book, written by Kroger and Kroger, and there's all kinds of scholarly citations of them and all kinds of other articles. They wrote a book called I Suffer Not a Woman, Rethinking 1 Timothy chapter 2, 11 through 15 in light of ancient evidence. So they're quoting, I suffer not a woman, what? To teach or exercise authority over a man. And they're saying that their thesis was that we need to rethink our interpretation of this text based on this evidence that we ourselves have discovered. Okay? And so they argued that the church has gotten the text wrong. You've gotten the text wrong for almost 2,000 years here, church. And now, with this historical evidence that we have compiled, we now are basically claiming that we've misunderstood and that we need to reinterpret this text as being only a temporal set of instructions for the Ephesian women, not a universal. So, we need to reinterpret these teachings in light of this historical context, and we need to get things right as a church. And then, of course, all kinds of other things that flow from that. Their argument was that Ephesus was especially matriarchal, with a strong network of a female cult and these female cult leaders. And it was associated with deep immorality, that's code talk for the worst of the stuff, and even death. It was a sexual death cult, to quote them, or at least to allude to them, to their argument. And that's why Paul was really dealing with the women the way that he does here in chapter 2. His instructions were only temporary, to try to get things back in order, and then at some point, the gospel would do so much work in their lives that these quote-unquote restrictions upon women would then be lifted, because that's the trajectory of the gospel. But this is just not the case. This is just not the case. Since 1992, another number of scholars have had to undo the work of Kroger and Kroger because it made such a massive impact. And most notably was Stephen Baugh. Just 2 years later, of course, he probably immediately got to work when the 1992 Kroger and Kroger book was published. So in 94, he published an article that dealt with their claims. Stephen Baugh was professor at Westminster Seminary in Escondido. He's still there and still does very good work. In 1994, he basically exposed all the supposed historical facts and showed that there's really nothing to them. That the things that they cite, a lot of them are actually just made up and their inferences from other parts of the world, like Brazil, not in Turkey, Ephesus. I can connect you to that article if you like. He showed that their historical evidence is mainly conjecture. Also, what is more, Kent Hughes, you might recognize his name, author of Disciplines of a Godly Man, which many of you have read. He also wrote another peer-reviewed article in 1999, where he also shows that the cultural background claims are actually unfounded. Kevin DeYoung, whose name you also probably recognize, also picks up on this in his little booklet called Freedom and Boundaries, where he says Ephesus, though it was a magnificent city, was unremarkable in regards to how it compared theologically, societally, to other Greco-Roman cities at the time. It was very typical in that regard. Though a glorious city, rich, but it was not somehow this hotbed for a matriarchal society that Paul was dealing with. It's just like many of the other cities that Paul deals with. As it pertains to this erroneous cultural instructional view of the Krogers, this has become a very popular view, and I hear it all the time. I hear it and I read about it all the time, and it's quoted and it's referred to as if it's the truth, when in reality, subsequent scholarship, which is how this works, undermines it and dismantles it and shows us that the church has in fact understood this text well. That's why I'm sharing these things with you this morning. I want you to be aware. I want you to know that those who claim the cultural background context as reason to weaken the apostles' authority here does not have a leg to stand on. Now, there are still interpretive issues in this text. There's no doubt. It's not like it's a simplistic text, but we'll deal with those things when we get to them, but we're not in them today. We get to unpack these things when we get to verse 12 in particular. How do we understand to teach, and how do we understand exercise authority? There is some difficulty there, and we'll own that. But I want you to be inoculated against what has really been shown to be a false perspective on this text. I'm sorry that has taken so much time, but I do think that it's important. Even if the scholarship did not bear these things out, the text itself does. Let me just show you one simple thing here, how the Scriptures prove themselves to be sufficient so that we can understand them rightly. Look back at verse 8. I've already made a big deal of this, but now you can see how it reflects down into the subsequent verses. Paul says, I want the men in every place to pray. Is there anyone out there, even in the liberal scholarship world, arguing against that? Nope, they're not, are they? In fact, they would emphasize that. Men, we need you to be praying more. How come it's always just the women who are praying, right? I want the men to pray in every place. You catch that phrase? In every place. Topos is the word place, and it means every geographic location. Why is Paul referencing every topos, every geographic location for the men? It's because previously in chapter 2, the gospel is going out to all men, right? The gospel is going out to all kinds of men. God wants all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. That means men in every place, in every time period. God is at work to bring the gospel of Christ to all men. And what is the fruit that it bears among all men? They pray. No matter what their cultural context is, in every topos, where we get the English word topography, right? Every place, I want men to pray. Now look how this flows right into verse 9. He begins with the word similarly, or likewise. And he does not repeat a verb. For those of you that want to know how the grammar works here, because this is also proving the point. The verb that is previously mentioned is want in verse 8. Therefore, I want. Paul wants the men. And then he does not repeat a verb for the women here. He says likewise, and most of your translations will include the word I want. The NASB does in italics to show you that it's inferred from verse 8. What Paul wants for the men in every place, here's what he wants for the women in every place. That's how that argument goes. Now, I know most of you don't need this argument. You are convinced that the Scriptures are in fact sufficient. However, again, I want you to understand what others say about this text and how you can, with good conscience, continue to bring it into your life. Okay? So Paul, these are the things that Paul wants for the women in every place. Finally, to the actual instructions. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing. I want to unpack each of these words with the few minutes that I have left, and I want you to see that Paul does not write a dress code. He gives a principle set of codes, right? These are principles that he gives Timothy to teach the women, okay? First, what he wants them to do is adorn, to adorn. I think the apostle here picks a beautiful word, really the Spirit does, to describe the attire a woman chooses. And as we'll see, though it certainly includes the literal clothing, ladies, that you choose to wear, this adornment is also about how you carry yourself. He's not only talking about the literal clothing, though he is certainly including clothing. He is also including how you live your life, how you carry yourself. Both aspects, the Spirit chooses this one word, cosmein, to adorn, and this word is not merely mechanical. To adorn is actually associated with beauty. It automatically conveys a sense of decorum and glory. The mechanical word that he could have used means to put on. We heard it in 2 Corinthians 5, right? This tent, I'm going to put one off, and then I'm going to have this other tent be put on. Or you can think about the way he used it in Ephesians 4, put off the old man, put on the new man, right? There's another Greek word for that when you're talking about just the mechanics of putting on clothing. Paul's not just looking at the mechanics. He's actually looking at the effect. He's not just talking about the physical act. The Spirit is not merely being utilitarian here, which I think is massively important. Paul does not say, in adorning yourselves, just do what works. Just find an old gunny sack and cut some holes in it. The way a woman clothes herself is to be about beyond just covering up. I think this is helpful and honest. Paul, nor the other apostle, Peter, who speaks similarly in chapter 3 of his first epistle, they do not conceptualize a woman's clothing being merely functional. A Christian woman is right, therefore, to think in terms of adornment, to think in terms of beauty in regard to her clothing and in regards to how she carries herself. This word cosmein is directly related to the word world. In most contexts, we think of the word world in the New Testament as a sort of negative thing. Do not love the world. But in its most basic sense, it's referring to this harmonious order, this beautiful arrangement of things, even this adornment of things. This is how the Septuagint uses it in the Old Testament. It speaks in terms of decoration and ornamentation. Titus chapter 2, Paul uses this word to apply to everyone, that everyone is to live their lives in such a way as to adorn the gospel. It doesn't mean just make the gospel functional. It means to highlight the glory and the beauty of the gospel. Let your good behavior reflect well on Christ. Let your good behavior draw attention in beautiful and orderly terms. Let your lives have a sense of decorum and be well decorated to draw attraction to the truth of the gospel. That's what this word means. Even our English word cosmetics comes from this word, cosmeo. Though, of course, I'm not going to make any direct application regarding makeup this morning. The only thing I have for you in this regard is to quote Dr. Ballio, who was one of my Bible professors in the late 90s, who is now with the Lord. He used to tell the ladies back then, it's okay for some of you to use cosmetics, because some barn doors need painting and some don't. That's all I have for you in regards to makeup. I really don't know what to make of that, only that I'm happy that I finally found a moment, 25 years later, that I could share that great quote. In all seriousness, Paul and Peter in his parallel passage, use this word to move us beyond just mere utilitarian, functional ideation of what clothing is. And it moves it into the category of beautifully arranging things, adorning in beauty. So, church and household of the living God, it is right and good for the ladies to think about beauty. Not just functionality, but beauty. At this point, again, I don't give any other practical help other than to say, ladies, it is good and right to dress and arrange yourself in ways that are in keeping with what truly is beautiful. And of course, therein is the challenge as well, isn't it? Because in some regard, it's difficult to define beauty. However, Paul, I think, gives us more help. I just want the point to come across that Paul nor Peter nor any of the apostles are saying, ladies, dress as drably as possible. Rather, Paul goes on to say to adorn yourself with proper clothing. And the word he uses here for proper evokes another sense of beauty, of decorum. In fact, the word brings forward the connotations of admiration, or that which produces delight. Clothing is to communicate something. It's to communicate admiration. It means that the wearer of whatever clothing is chosen is not only beyond just mechanical and functional, it moves towards delight. But delighting in what is respectable, delighting in what is honorable. And it's not only about what's communicated about the wearer, about the woman who's choosing these clothing, that she herself is respectable, that she herself is honorable, but that she is respecting others and that she is honoring others in her clothing choices. It's not just about her. It's about what her clothing communicates to others. And Paul is insinuating, yes, your clothing communicates, and it ought to communicate adornment and decorum and beauty. Not just functionality, not just mechanics. And it also needs to communicate Christian virtue, respectability, honorability. Again, notice that Paul doesn't say anything about dresses or pants or skirts or blouses or even culottes, which were cool in the 80s. Paul doesn't give a dress code. He doesn't give a dress code. But his instructions are about principles. And so, ladies, when you are designing what it is that you will wear, you need to think in terms of what is honorable and what is honoring. What is admirable and what is delightful in gospel and Christian terms. What does the wearer communicate and what does the observer interpret? Does it produce a sense of delightfulness in the congregation? And really not just in a delightfulness of, oh, that lady's pretty, but really a delightfulness in Christ honoring godliness. Is there a communication that I am delighting in the gospel and I want others to delight in the gospel? And Paul is insinuating that your clothes can communicate things like that. And so it's about being adorned in a way that communicates Christian virtue, certainly not worldly virtue. And of course, let's just own it, there are some real cultural elements at work in each society about how it interprets clothing, right? That's real. Paul's not erasing that. Again, which is why he doesn't give a dress code. He gives principles. He gives principles. Paul trusts the sufficiency of his Christ-given words and the sufficiency of the Spirit to apply them in the heart of every Christian woman in every place the gospel has come. That she's going to be enabled to dress in keeping with principles of beauty, honor, and godliness. But Paul adds more. He adds more to further aid Christian women. The first word is, and he adds it with this, with modesty and discretion, or with, and each translation kind of does something differently. I'm just using the term modest, but I'm going to explain the Greek word here. Adus. With modesty, with adus. it really is a term of contrast. So when you think in terms of beyond functionality, into beauty, into adornment, into decorum, and then honorable, respectable, delightful kind of clothing, he then says it needs to have a contrasting effect. This word means the opposite of what is common and vulgar and shameful. What is opposite of common, vulgar, and shameful. This is why the King James Version uses shamefacedness. That's quite a word that I don't hear every day. Shamefacedness. It really just means a proper restraint grounded in moral awareness. Let me read that again. Proper restraint that's grounded or rooted in moral awareness. That a Christian woman has a moral awareness about her. That she's able to see what is common and vulgar and shameful in society. And she chooses a path of restraint grounded in this awareness. And the sense is that she would be ashamed to be found wearing something that is considered common, vulgar, or shameful. That she even has a sense of shame of not wanting to be associated with those things in society that everyone knows is shameful and vulgar and unhonoring and not delightful and not beautiful in the Christian sense. And so thereby the Christian woman chooses something respectable instead. She does not go down the path of shameful clothing. She goes down the path of honoring types of clothing. The same sense is conveyed in uses of this word in Greek literature, in classical Greek and mythological writings. It conveys this sense of discreetness. Some of your translations use the word discreet here, and this is helpful. And some of these examples, when some characters had the opportunity in these mythologies, when, in particular, a young woman had the opportunity to be brash, to be shameful, to be vulgar, to be sexually promiscuous, they instead admirably chose to be virtuous, modest, adus. They chose the contrasting posture in view of brashness, shamefulness, and promiscuity. Instead, they chose what is admirable, virtuous, and modest. Paul's like, that's how you think about your clothing. In other words, we can know what it means by comparison. We can know what is considered common and vulgar and shameful and promiscuous by looking. And Paul says to the ladies, hey, the principle that guides you says avoid that. And again, he doesn't list types of clothing. He just says choose what is virtuous, modest, respectable, discreet, honorable, delightful, and so on. And he adds one more word, wise. Sophronin. Temperance, prudence, self-control. Christian women who know Christ and love Christ, they want to convey in all of their behavior, in all of their devotion to Christ, even what they choose to wear and how they comport themselves or carry themselves, a sense of self-controlledness. It is the fruit of the Spirit. But there is a sense of self-control in what they choose to wear and how they adorn themselves. Again, it means that what you wear communicates that you have a character of temperance and at ease with wisdom, that there's a soundness of mind. There's a rational way of thinking that is in keeping with Christian virtue, and your clothing communicates that. I need to keep going. Down in the second part of verse 9, he then goes on to say, after giving these principles, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. That's mid-sentence, actually. We need to see how this phrase builds up to verse 10. So it goes like this, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. The second part of verse 9 is contrasted with verse 10. That's what we need to see. At first glance, it sounds like Paul is making a prohibition against braids. Some of you would be in big trouble, right? Paul's making a prohibition against braids or certain kinds of jewelry and even certain numbers on a price tag. But he's really emphasizing where the focus needs to be in your adorning. It's not ultimately about how your hair is arranged, or how much jewelry you put on, or how much clothes cost. It needs to be about adorning yourself in good works. Peter does the same thing. Listen to this parallel text that I've been referencing. Peter says, your adornment must not be external. Now, most of your translations are actually going to add the word merely in there because it catches the sense. Your adornment must not merely be external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses. But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves. And then he goes on to describe that woman's relationship with her husband. In other words, Peter nor Paul are saying, it's ultimately not about your clothing. It's about the inner person. It's about your character. And your character is going to come out. The overarching principle is a pursuit of godliness. And it's a pursuit of gospel-produced godliness, not a law-produced godliness as the false teachers in chapter 1 were trying to do. So the application is, don't let yourself be all consumed or only known for how you do your hair, or how much jewelry you have, or how expensive your clothing is. There should be zero competition in those areas in the Father's household among the ladies. Zero competition. There's no need, ladies, to strive to be the prettiest, the richest, the fittest, the best dressed, the most admired, or the coolest hair, the most glamorous, or any other kind of pursuit like that. You're all to understand yourselves as daughters of the Most High God in Jesus Christ. And He has made each one of you with intention and is at work in your life by grace. And the same goes for all your sisters. All ladies have varying degrees of wealth, natural attractiveness, various types of hair and eye color. There are different shapes and sizes of bodies and of closets and of jewelry chests. It would deeply grieve the Lord if those things created distinctions among you. Just as the men are not to show up here hypocritically and raise their hands in prayer all the while quarreling with one another behind the scenes. In the same sense, it would be terrible to have the ladies come even modestly, nicely, in Christian ways dressed, but underneath there's all of this competition. It's not fitting in the household of God. It would grieve the Lord if there were those kinds of distinctions among us. We must, ladies, have the wisdom and the self-control and the discretion to dress accordingly in view of these principles. And so we are called, and the ladies are called, to adorn themselves modestly, honorably, and beautifully in ways that highlight the virtue of Christ Jesus. And this is what the apostle would have you pursue. But above pursuing and thinking through your clothing, which you must do, you must clothe yourselves in good works. Look again at verse 10. But rather what? What's the verb? Adorn yourselves by means of good works. Ladies, this is what you spend your time giving yourself to. Of course, do your nails, get your hair done, whatever. But seriously, for the sake of the gospel in this community, in the sake of this household of faith, be known for good works. Be known for good works. Be known for being women who love Christ, who serve others in the body through hospitality, through telling the truth, through sharing with others not only earthly possessions but the gospel. For the married, as Peter picks up on, for the married, give yourselves to care for your husband and your children, your grandchildren. All of you care for your neighbors. All of you give yourself to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. Be in His Word. Be in prayer. Spend far more time in those things than in the beauty shop. These are the principles that guide clothing and adornment for Christian women. And this is what Paul wants in every place that the gospel arrives. He wants the men to pray in faithfulness. He wants the ladies to adorn themselves with proper clothing and, more importantly, with good works that are produced from the gospel. Finally, notice to whom this verb belongs. And this is important. This is one more big uppercut to those who would like to bring a charge against the apostle here. Notice to whom this verb belongs. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves. It's actually emphasized in the Greek. Themselves. Men, Paul does not envision the leading men of the congregation micromanaging what ladies wear. The responsibility is on the ladies to apply the principles, to manage their own clothing in ways that communicate godliness, self-control, and modesty. It really is a matter, ladies, of inward orientation. If you are overly dependent upon the elders to show up and be like, wear this dress, not that dress, you are missing the point massively. And if we ever begin to devolve that way, someone needs to pull the fire alarm. Adorn themselves. These are Christian women who can think through the reality of the work of Christ in their life. They can understand what the word modest means. They can understand what the word self-control means. They can understand what adornment means. So work it out. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to work and to will, according to His good pleasure. It really is a matter of inward orientation and inward obedience first, and then outward adornment takes place. Again, that's not to say, can't fall in the ditch, that the Lord doesn't care about what I wear. Yes, He does. But how do you tackle it? I think of Jesus' words, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you're full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." Ladies, this is not just about Googling a modest Christian wear, and I'm just going to buy that whole whatever Instagram lady list. And then now your work is done. You can wear all the right clothes, and yet your heart can still be full of competition, of deceit, of hypocrisy. No real godliness from the heart. Jesus says, cleanse the inner part of your heart first, and that comes through the gospel of Christ. You would confess your sins of competition and pride. You confess whatever other sins are related to your heart as it pertains to what you wear and how you behave, how you carry yourself. Let Christ cleanse. Let Christ renew. And then let the outside of the cup follow. No doubt there are all kinds of conversations that could happen between godly women in the congregation about how to work out some details. There's no doubt that has to take place from time to time. Ladies, be open to that conversation between one another. But keep the principles in view. And we will be conducting ourselves in a way that is pleasing to the Lord as His household and as His family. Let's pray.